Okay, welcome to this week's Weekend Waffle, and what I wanted to really get into is the idea of being a fanboy, because Mr Benway did a video yesterday, and really this is a response to that video, and his video was about, well, the title was Fanboy Much, ? And it wasn't really a question, but he made a very good point, and he talked about a study that had been done, and it was saying that people who would be typical fanboys would have low self-esteem. And I thought about that for a bit, and I think there have been twice when I would have been a fanboy of a particular platform. One would have been the Atari ST, and the other one was the Saturn and the Dreamcast. But I think I'd go one step further with that statement about having low self-esteem. I think it's not necessarily having low self-esteem in yourself. I think it's having low self-esteem in the console or the computer that you're supporting feverishly. So I think with the ST, there were a lot of ST fanboys back in the day, myself included. And when I compare it to the Amiga, I mean, now you look at it and clearly they're for different purposes. The ST was more like a Mac clone. But for games, we say, ST games were way better than the Amiga, and you look at them now, and there are very few cases where the ST game was better. But we ignore that. You'd come up with stupid excuses for the ST being better. But I think with the Mega Drive era, I think the fanboyism wasn't too much of a problem, because the Mega Drive and the SNES, they were both healthy consoles. They both had a good selection of games. And I don't think there was a lot of hostility. But I think my almost like second phase of fanboyism, and I've gone through this in, actually I think it was the first Weekend Waffle I talked about this, about supporting the underdog. And this was where Sega really started to become the underdog. And I think that's why I became very much a Saturn fanboy, as I've mentioned many times in videos. I didn't like the PS1 and I did not like Sony. And I think I saw this really as Sony being a big company who was going to commercialise games and take away almost like the innocence that we had of it being a hobby to this being this big mainstream thing. And I think Sony marketed the PS1 really well. They went after your kind of nightclubbing types in the mid-90s, kind of raver types, or was that a little bit before? I'm too young anyway. But they were going after nightclubs and trying to associate with that scene, and I hated that in the early 90s. I was about 14, and I didn't like that dance music. I still don't like dance music, but then it didn't appeal, and I just saw it as being this almost like an obscenity, this console which was so trendy, and it was selling to people that typically didn't play games, and it was changing everything. And I felt really hurt by that at the time. But I think looking back, I would take the Saturn games and I would say, oh, it's so much better than the PS1. And I remember having a friend who had a PS1, and I attacked his machine so severely. And I remember just talking about, is one down there? Yeah. Even going down to the hinge being flaky compared to the Saturn. I mean, the Saturn's got a slightly better quality hinge, but who cares? It really didn't matter. But as a Saturn fanboy, you'd say, oh, the Saturn's got better build quality. But the games, for the most part, particularly 3D ones, I've mentioned this before, the first party titles from Sega, the 3D titles, were really good, but usually the ports or the third party titles were not, the Saturn ones were not quite as good as the PS1. And I remember just attacking, saying the PS1's got no good games, and looking back, it's rubbish. But I think a lot of this has come from, and I think it wasn't just myself, I think if you read Sega magazines at the time, it was fighting this cause for the Saturn and the Dreamcast to an extent. And if you look back at the Sega Saturn magazines now from the late 90s, you can really tell it was a losing battle. There were very few new games coming out, and it was the same games they were talking about every month, but they really hyped them. And I think with that, it kind of supports the theory that you become a fanboy because you personally feel that your console is fighting a losing battle, and unless you fight for it, it's, you know, it's going to lose. And I think a lot of Saturn owners felt like that because Sega had been on top with the Mega Drive, and even with the Mega CD, it was a failing platform, but you could always go back to the Mega Drive. So you always had two machines. You had the Mega CD and the Mega Drive, and as much as a SNES owner might bash a Mega CD, you can always go, oh well, we've got the Mega Drive with all these great games. But with the Saturn, and I think the Dreamcast, this was where it started to really descend. And I think in a way, going back to Steve's comments about the Amiga, I think it was similar. That with the PC, this big corporate, you know, type of computer was destroying and dominating the little guy who was the Amiga. And I think in a way, Amiga people would have felt the same way, that, you know, their innocence was being taken away and the fun factor was going out of it. But at the same time, looking back now, the PS1 and the DOS PCs, they did wonders for the industry. They changed it, certainly. Maybe for the better, maybe not, but they certainly brought about so many more opportunities that we wouldn't have now. And I think with the PS1 and the PlayStation brand, it was something that kind of crept up on me slowly, because after the Dreamcast got cancelled, as a Sega fan, who are you going to go to? Microsoft was coming around, and in, you know, love them or hate them for computers and operating systems and things, for Windows, for the games consoles, they were an unknown entity. So I think, you know, at that time I thought, well, the Dreamcast seems a bit like the new Xbox, and Project Gotham was Metropolis Street Racer 2, and a lot of games that were coming out on the Dreamcast were coming out on the Xbox, and Shenmue 3 was supposed to come out on the Xbox, which never did. So I went on to that, and I think that's how I got into being a supporter of Microsoft. But the PlayStation was a brand that, having, you know, despised them in the 90s, once I had the Xbox, didn't really matter anymore. They were just another console manufacturer like Sega and Nintendo. There was no real hostility. And I bought a PS1 probably around 2004, 2003, 2004. And I bought it really just to play a couple of games, because I liked the Namco games, and there were a few you know, games like Final Fantasy, the Square games, Final Fantasy 7, 8 and 9. I really enjoyed those, and I bought them just to play those games, and I actually enjoyed it. I bought quite a lot of games. And the same with the PS2. After I bought the 360, I wanted to play games like Shadow of the Colossus, and I just bought them cheap. And it was almost like a collateral thing, that I just bought them and really enjoyed those machines. And I look back now and I'm thinking, I was so wrong. I don't think I was wrong liking Sega and liking the Saturn. I mean, we didn't know what, you know, which way it was going to go. Certainly the Saturn and the PlayStation were a lot more healthier than the Jaguar, the 3DO and the CDI and all those machines. So, you know, the Saturn seemed like a good choice. But I think being a fanboy really does blind you that actually the other platforms do have good titles, and arguing about silly things really, you know, it doesn't matter. Who gives a shit? You know, there are good games on any platform. And I think that was similar with the Wii and the GameCube. I bought those machines really just to play one or two games like Metroid, and bought them cheap second hand, and then just built up some games. And it wasn't a huge thing. It wasn't like investing in a big console. It was a secondary console. And, you know, I really enjoyed those, and I wouldn't say I'm a fanboy or, you know, fan of either of those platforms. They're just there, and the games are good, and I think that's all that matters. Although I think on that point, yeah, the Wii. It's a shame that the Wii U isn't a little bit cheaper, because I think if it was, Nintendo would sell a lot more machines, because what they really should be going for is the market for people who are buying second consoles, cheap second-hand, or not maybe second-hand, but second consoles, and they just want them cheap to buy a few games in an impulse buy. And I think if Nintendo, once they get that price point, I do wonder whether that'll pick up, but that's another thing. And then you get people who like, Nintendo games. I was never a big fan of them. I like some of the Mario games and Donkey Kong and SNES games, but other than that, I would never say I was a Nintendo fanboy. So I think I'll leave it there. That's a really long response, but it just supports the idea that I think if someone's a fanboy, maybe there's an insecurity about their own machine, and it's fighting a battle for that platform. So you never know, maybe there were CDI fanboys, maybe. I mean, there are certainly people who are very enthusiastic about the Amiga now, 18 years, 19 years? No. Yeah, it is 19 years after Commodore folded, so, maybe there's nothing wrong in flying the flag, but I think being a fanboy can make you very blind that the other platform has a lot to offer. And I think in the case of, my fanboy phase in the mid-90s, I think it did a lot of damage. I think there were a lot of really good games and experiences I missed out on. So I think I'll leave it there. That's probably coming up to about 20 minutes or so. So yeah, really good, well, not question, but topic from Steve about being a fanboy. It certainly gives you a lot to think about. So thanks for watching.